Hello again, this is Chris, MTGO's Rex Dart. We are back in another episode of the ongoing video series examining the popular archetypes that have been played in the Tribal Legacy Wars format and the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event. Sorry I missed last week, but we're back this week, and we're going to be taking a look at graveyard combo decks. Now, if you remember back to when I did the Reanimator video, we talked about a distinction here that Reanimator decks are attempting to kill you by bringing back some kind of fat creature and actually winning with those creatures. And so those decks are distinct from these graveyard combo decks in that you can fight those decks along a normal axis of gameplay, you know, creature removal, which most of your decks are going to have. Now, the targets for reanimation are usually going to have some kind of great enter the battlefield ability or be resistant to removal or something along those lines so that they still get some value out of it. But theoretically, if you happen to be packing the right kind of removal, you can try to fight through them in a normal way. But these graveyard decks are not always like that. They may or may not attempt to win in a conventional manner, and one of the things that sort of makes them problematic is just that they basically play along a completely different axis. I remember I was playing Legacy Tribal Wars on MTGO several months back, and I was in the casual room, and I wandered over to the tournament practice room, and I actually saw a match there for Tribal Wars, and I almost never do. And I remember asking the player why he was playing in the tournament practice room, and he said, well, his deck was he thought he'd broken the format, and his deck was so cutthroat that he didn't want to get everyone pissed off about it in the casual room. But everyone usually treats Legacy Tribal Wars games as fairly casual, you know, outside of the event. And so I went ahead and played him, and sure enough, it was a Manaless dredge deck, much like the one that we see here that Chamail played just last week. And of course, Kuma talked about this deck in the article last week, so I don't need to spend an enormous amount of time on it. But it is worth taking a look at just because it has all of the elements of a conventional dredge deck tacked onto sort of the oddity of being completely manaless, which is a variety of dredge. It's probably the cheapest variety of dredge to build ticket-wise, since you don't need lion's eye diamonds or some of those other things. But the basic idea is that you get a guy into your graveyard, such as the Phantasmagorian, which allows you to then discard your dredge guys into your graveyard to return him from your hand. So you have to be on the draw in order to play this deck so that you can then discard a Phantasmagorian. And then from there, once you have guys in your graveyard, every card draw, instead of drawing a card, of course, you will dredge and fill up your graveyard. And the thing that this deck does is that you can not really effectively in Magic draw your entire deck in a natural way. Ever since Ancestral Recall was printed, they've only a couple times come even close to printing a card draw spell, you know, nearly comparable to that. Card draw has been massively nerfed over the years. But if the cards that are in your graveyard are things that you can use, then every card you dump into your graveyard is basically just enormous card advantage. And so you can more or less do the equivalent of drawing your entire deck by turn 4 or 5 just by using these dredge guys to completely fill up your deck. And if that wasn't bad enough, again, it has all these guys that come back. It's got Cabal Therapy to try to fight through some hate, if there is any, which you're probably not going to see, quite frankly. Because, again, over the years, Wizards has just now recently gotten better about doing this, but before the past few years, there haven't really been a lot of cards that would fight dedicated graveyard strategies that had any usefulness outside of that context. And now we're just starting to see some of them get printed. But over the years, most of those cards have been designed to be solely sideboard cards, so you're just not going to expect. In the Legacy format, the wider Legacy format, it's common to say that the real games against Dredge are games 2 and 3. Game 1, they're just going to roll you unless you have a much faster combo deck. But games 2 and 3, where they have to resort to alternative sort of methods of beatdown, attacking with Narcomoebas, that sort of thing, a little more competitive games, because of your graveyard hate, the fact that they have to play around it depending on what it is. But in the Legacy Tribal Wars format with no sideboards, you basically don't get games 2 and 3. So it's like playing game 1 of the Dredge matchup every single game throughout an entire tournament. And so like the fella said several months ago I was playing against, he thought he had broken the format essentially by doing this. So you could say that about a lot of different combo decks, but graveyard decks, because they attack on an angle that nobody else is prepared to deal with normally, have that extra advantage. Now, there are sometimes some incidental things, and we're going to talk about some of the things that your deck might be able to do, even if you don't have dedicated graveyard hate. You'll see here that one of the key things for a Dredge deck is a Bridge from Below, which they have to get it into their graveyard, and once they have it in their graveyard, any creature that goes into their graveyard, it gives them zombies, one zombie for each Bridge from Below. Of course, all these zombies that they generate then can be used along with the Narcomoebas, the Nether Shadows, and the other things that are returning from the graveyard every turn to fuel Dread Return. Which, again, this is Manaless Dredge, so it's never going to hard cast it, but you can use those Dread Returns once you get those into your yard to bring back whatever your win condition is. This particular list, which Chamail played to first place last week, the win condition is more or less arbitrary in these decks. Once you manage to dump your whole graveyard into the deck, you're going to have some way to win. You're just going to have devoted 2 or 3 cards to doing that. In this particular case, he has this Sun Titan Mael's Aria in here just to get the achievement, but it could easily have been any number of things. The key to fighting against Dredge is to get rid of their bridges. You will sometimes have ways that you can get rid of your bridges, because it will go away if you kill one of your own creatures, even if they don't cooperate in doing that. So, for instance, if you have a Sacro Tribelder or Mog Fanatic, maybe a Grim Lavamancer or something like that on your board, you could just shoot one of your own creatures to try to get rid of the bridges. The deck is not crippled without the bridges, but it's not nearly as good without the bridges. Without the bridges, they lose sort of the zombie beatdown plan, and they're pretty much going all in on whatever their big Dread Return target is at that point. So there is that way to fight it. Also, your deck might have incidental graveyard hate. Most tribes don't really have good ones, but occasionally zombies or clerics might play a Withered Wretch or something along those lines that is able to fight it. In that case, again, your bridges are one of your biggest targets. If you have instant speed, graveyard hate repeatable like a Withered Wretch, of course you want to be able to remove whatever the Dread Return target is in response to him casting it, but just doing the Dread Return if he has a Bridge from Below in the yard is going to give him a ton of zombies. Also remember that this checks on the triggers for Bridge from Below check on resolution. So if he sacrifices a bunch of stuff to play a Dread Return while he has a Bridge from Below in the graveyard, you can get rid of the Bridge from Below in response to that, and it will check on resolution whether or not Bridge from Below is still in the graveyard. If it's not, he will not get the zombies. So good things to know there. We're going to move on to some of the other decks here, and every time we look at one, we're going to talk about some of the ways that you could fight this deck with things that you might normally have in your deck. Now, the next one we're going to take a look at is this is Living End. It's a Mutant's shell for this one this time, but it has been played in a number of different shells. This one was piloted to first place by Raf Azevedo on March 3rd of this year in Event 61. And he played Living End decks with a number of different tribes. But the basic idea, if you haven't seen a Living End deck before, and I'm assuming most of you have, but we will take a look at it. is that Living End is basically a Living Death, which was an old 5-mana sorcery that uh, basically put everything that was in the graveyard into play and everything that was into play in the graveyard. Living End is the time spiral update of that, which you cannot actually hardcast. You have to suspend it, which would make it worse, except for the fact that the interaction between the suspend cards and Cascade, just as in the Hypergenesis decks, allows you to trigger any of these 6 Cascade spells into a Living End guaranteed, as long as you don't play with anything that is below 3 converted mana cost other than the Living Ends. And so what you do is you play with all these guys that are more expensive than that and have cycling abilities in order to get them into your graveyard. Since they're coming from your graveyard back into play when you do resolve the Living End, the cycling becomes a sort of super cycling, because you're not only getting another card to fuel your future cycling, but the guy that you're cycling away is right where you want him to be. So it is a very effective deck. You want sometimes to have, if the tribe you're using it with has that, to have these enter the battlefield abilities and other things along that nature. Part of the reason for that is that the first Living End is always very good. The second Living End may not be as good, because if you're forced to have to do it again, the opponent's going to get his guys back from the graveyard. But if you have a lot of these enter the battlefield guys who can take out, such as a Deadshot Minotaur, and there are others that are played in other shells, can help take out whatever wave of creatures is coming back from the opponent. And that is, if you don't have dedicated graveyard hate for this deck, the way that you have to fight it is mostly you have to go ahead and try to put enough pressure on them that they have to go for it before they want to. So if you have enough creatures on the board, or enough power in your creatures on the board, that they have to go for this, while they only have, say 3 or 4 of these guys in the graveyard, then you're in much better position than if you do that while they've got 7 or 8 guys in the graveyard. But of course, that is the problem. The more you overextend, you're overextending into what is effectively a sweeper. And so unless you have a flurry of burn or something like that, it's going to be hard to finish them off, because they'll have this board position that is going to be much better than you're going to be able to do with the cards you have remaining in hand. Alternatively, if you have a way to get guys into your own graveyard in response to this, if you're a Reanimator deck, for instance, you're going to have a very good day here, because you're going to be able to dump much better guys into the graveyard than they are, and be able to benefit more from the Living End than the Living End deck itself does. Also worth keeping in mind that Living End is cascaded to. It is cast, so you can counterspell the Living End. Remember not to counterspell the Cascade spell. Counterspell the Living End. You can also do a Chalice of the Void on 0, since this is 0 converted mana cost. That would shut off the Living End. You could name Living End with Meddling Mage. Those are some of the ways that you could fight this with spells that you might have access to that aren't dedicated graveyard hate. The next deck that we're going to take a look at is the Cephalid Breakfast deck, which is being called the Cephalid Breakfast deck. This is Dirty Duck has been playing this for off and on for, I guess, several months at this point. I actually this was a list that finished first place in Tribal Apocalypse 84 on August 11th of this year. He's improved the mana base the last time I saw this deck from what this was, but other than that, it's basically the same idea. What he's doing here, and this is called Cephalid Breakfast in regular Legacy, is you use a Cephalid Illusionist to target it with the Nomad's Encore, which has a free repeatable target ability. The Cephalid Illusionist therefore ends up milling your own entire library, and again, once you've milled your own entire library, the win condition is essentially arbitrary. You can put whatever the heck you want in there to finish off the game. There are, I guess, optimal ways and suboptimal ways to do it. His particular way of doing it has the advantage that he brings back basically a by a dread return, he brings back a Mimeoplasm, which will then copy the Murderous Redcaps Enter the Battlefield ability with the Lord of Extinction's power and toughness, and so that it gets a kill without having to go through the combat step. And generally, a kill that does not have to use the combat step is less resistant to things the opponent can do. So that's the preferred way of doing this. He also has a nice backup plan here with the Stoneforge Mystics being able to tutor up a Batterskull or a Sword of Fire and Ice, in case he did run up against something that shut down the combo aspect here. But of course, the Stoneforge Mystic also serving to tutor up the Shuko, which he can then use to repeatedly target the Cephalid Illusionist for free with the equip ability, and accomplish the same thing. So one of his combo pieces essentially is tutorable, which is always an advantage in a combo deck. But again, he has a beatdown backup plan here with the Mystics. Could fetch Batterskull or Sword. He's got Core Duelist. So again, one of the principles we were talking about early on about with the Reanimator decks, you see again here, is that sometimes you need to have a plan B, and his certainly does that. He's crammed in a bunch of cantrips here to look for the combo. He's going pretty all in. His plan B with the Stoneforge Mystics is compact enough that he has the room to do that and still have one. So an excellently designed deck here that's had a lot of success. You can look at lists over the past several months that have been used by, I believe Chamail's done something similar to this before, where he was using, again, some completely arbitrary win condition that just happened to meet an achievement. So this is this deck here. If you want to interact with this deck and you don't have any kind of graveyard hate, if you can stop the Murderous Redcaps Enter the Battlefield ability, that, say, a Torpor Orb or something would also be good against Stoneforge Mystic, but you're not likely to have something quite that narrow in your deck. I recall seeing a replay where I think Mia Hitlor had a Burnt and Forged Tender or something to prevent all the damage from a red source, and of course the Mimeoplasm would come in as red if it was using the Murderous Redcap, and was able to blow him out in response basically with that. But once both of these guys are in play, you can't just kill the Illusionist with removal, because he can just keep targeting with the Nomads and Cores. So you pretty much have to kill the Nomads in response to him playing the Cephalid Illusionist, and if he's playing careful, he's not even really going to give you a chance to do that. So this deck is extremely difficult without any kind of other effects. Now, because his combo here is a little more compact, he is more vulnerable to extraction effects, and I know Kuma's been pushing the use of extraction effects to fight these kind of decks, which in general I don't think extraction effects are all that great. However, I have been looking at some that I think have a little more utility. Generally, if you can find one that fits your deck for other reasons, an extraction effect on any of these critical pieces here would take out the combo aspect, and then you're only fighting against the Stoneforge Mystic Batterskull deck. And I say only in massive quotes, because that can be difficult on its own, quite difficult enough. But that is another way that you can go with that. And if for some reason you actually did bring some sort of hate for this combo that was permanent based, he's actually even packing these Core Sanctifiers, which could take the thing out. So really you're in an uphill battle against this deck, and just kind of hope that nobody plays it. That's probably the best strategy. Finally, we're going to look at an Ooze combo deck. This one was played by Kumagoro to a second place finish, but it was undefeated side by side of AJ's Gargoyles on that day. This was January 7th in Tribal Apocalypse 53. So second place, but equally undefeated before the challenge rules went into place. And what Kuma's got going on here is a Buried Alive for, and the way he describes it in his article, there's different ways that you could do this depending on what the board state is. But the ideal here is you're going to Bury It Alive for Anger to give your guy haste, assuming you have a mountain out. You're going to have to fetch one of these fetch lands in here, because he's not really playing that many. along with the Kiki Jiki and the Devoted Druid, so that then the following turn you can cast the Necrotic Ooze, give it the abilities of everything in the graveyard, such as copying itself with the Kiki Jiki, and then untapping itself with Devoted Druid, so that it can copy itself again and again and again. And as Kuma pointed out when he talked about this back in January, it has the advantage of being able to untap back in response. We always to be able to use this Devoted Druid ability, since you're not having to target something as the other Kiki Jiki combos are. So attempts to kill the ooze with removal don't really matter. Unless I guess you have enough of them to, well, the -1/-1 counters won't even resolve first. So, well, it's a cost. Yeah, so I guess if you had a 3 spot removals, that might work. Short of that, really no way to disrupt it with spot removal. Now, of course, that is a attack step based combo, making infinite guys. So if you have something like a Teferi's Moat or Ghostly Prison, something along those lines, you could prevent the opponent from being able to go out kill you with the infinite guys. So you might have something to stop that. You could also stop it with a Cursed Totem or Linvala, something that attacks activated abilities, for instance. But if you did have something like that in play, he could also go for a Visara the Dreadful and kill your Linvala or whatever the problem creature was. He's got acidic slimes to fight through any permanent-based answers that aren't creatures to your graveyard combo. He also has in here a Mitotic Slime, which works quite well with Recurring Nightmare because the Mitotic Slime just keeps making more guys. Recurring Nightmare, very interesting card that Kuma likes to play with a lot in his builds. Basically, what you're doing is paying 2 and a black to trade a creature on the battlefield for a creature in your graveyard, and you can do that as many times as you can pay 2 and a black, because returning the Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand is part of the cost. So as long as you've got mana, you can keep doing that, and you can keep sacrificing through a Mitotic Slime and bringing anything back from the grave that you need to bring back. He's also got some Birds of Paradise in here to help on mana fixing, accelerate him out, and Worldly Tutors to help search up whatever the key creature parts of his combo are. I suppose his backup sort of buried alive here. He also has a straight beatdown plan. Necrotic Ooze on his own isn't actually that bad. I mean, he's nothing to write home about, but he is a 4/3 for 4. If you got a Chameleon Colossus in the yard, your Necrotic Ooze can start doubling his own power and swing through that way. So you have some other options here if the graveyard is being shut down. So anyways, that's a look at the graveyard combo decks that have been popular this year. As you can see, there's not a lot of great ways, and your deck may not have any way to interact with these decks at all. And they have varying power levels, but you know, if they get going, a lot of times they're basically just insta-win decks, and they may not be very fun to play against if you don't have some way to interact with them. And so it's something to keep in mind. You won't see them every single week, but when you do see them, you're just going to be slapping your forehead and going, really? You know. So join me next week when we're going to take a look at the final miscellaneous combo decks that I haven't covered up until this point, and that should conclude the series. And I thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week.